Alright, what's up guys? My name is Zach and today I am driving a 1988 Ford Tempo GLS. Up front is a 2.3 liter inline 4 and down below is a 3-speed automatic transmission. Now I am super excited to be driving this here Ford Tempo for a couple of reasons, mainly the fact that I've never driven one like this. I have been deep diving into American front-wheel drive cars from the 80s, and this is awesome to see, and so I can compare it to some other ones that I've driven from their competitors across the table at GM. But before we get on to anything else, I have a website, zackpradel.com, where you can buy stickers and other merchandise when it becomes available. You could also submit your own vehicle to be reviewed by me through a quick and easy submission form, and you get a video of your car just like this one. And you could read my behind-the-scenes blog to see what I'm filming before it comes out on the channel. But let's get back to that 2.3 liter under the hood. It makes just above 100 horsepower. Like I said, paired to it, 3-speed automatic. It's kind of lazy, but it does the job. And last but not least, it is front-wheel drive. However, I do want to talk about the ride quality, because I just went over some train tracks and didn't really feel it. This actually has a really nice, comfy suspension setup. Now, that means when I do end up taking a corner, whatever's not strapped down is going out the window, but still, it is a nice, comfortable, floaty ride. So with that stuff out of the way, let's talk about the interior. Well, in front of me, I have a bunch of gauges. On the left is my tachometer. In the center, I do get a speedometer with 55 highlighted. Still part of that era where 55 miles an hour was highlighted on most speedometers. I do have a full video about that if you're curious as to why that might be. Then off to the right, I do have my fuel gauge and my temperature gauge, of which the normal range is actually a lot larger than it is on a lot of other vehicles. Kind of interesting. The steering wheel is nicely sized. It is wrapped in leather for the GLS, and I do have cruise control options, so on the left is on and off, and on the right is resume, set, acceleration, and coast. Moving off to the left of me, I do have my wipers on the side of the gauge cluster, very 80s, and then I do have 2 climate control vents, very, very nice, and my headlight switches down below. Moving onto the door, I do get power locks and power windows. All very, very nice options. Moving into the center, I do get a very small climate control section. This is adorably tiny. It just says off floor defrost, window defrost. I mean, it's very, very small. I find that funny. However, the fan speed is actually off to the left, again on the gauge cluster, but separated from the rest of the climate controls. Very, very interesting. Then I get 2 climate control vents in the center, and moving down we do have the radio. This is the factory Ford radio. As you can see, the little Ford logo. And I do get some bass, treble, and balance and fade, which is, of course, awesome for the 80s. As well as I do have a cassette player. We'll talk about that again in a second. Then I do get a fold-out cigarette lighter and ashtray, and then I get my cassette storage down on the floor. That's why I said we'd talk about it, which I find kind of interesting. That's something we definitely don't see anymore. Then we get the shifter. The shifter is very tall, very plasticky and flimsy, but hey, what can you do? Then we have the parking brake and a couple of warning lights. These warning lights are actually for the power seatbelts. So this car does have power seatbelts from the factory. Again, I have another video explaining why we had power seatbelts here in America. This was very much an American thing. But the little warning light is down here and the emergency releases. But what you won't find down here is a factory cup holder. So the 1988 Ford Tempo GLS fails the big friggin' bottle test. But now moving on to the seats, like I said, I do have those power seat belts, a very 80s thing, but the actual seats themselves are very, very comfortable. This material carried on through Fords in the 90s, and I really, really miss it. I grew up with a Ford Taurus, and so it really gives me the nostalgia of that. It also should be noted that the front seats are power as well, which is very, very nice, and they have lumbar support. Really nice for 1988. However, speaking of seats, we do have back seats, so let's go do a backseat review. All right, so we're in the back of the 1988 Ford Tempo sedan, and a couple of things to note. First of all, the back seats are really straight up. They're like at a hard 90-degree angle. I only get lap belts back here. Again, very characteristic of 80s cars. And I do have a push-out ashtray back here. Again, a very, very 80s car feature. But other than that, I still get power windows. The headliner isn't completely sagging, although This little back corner is gone, but not the end of the world. It's actually an okay back seat. When I sit up, normally my knees aren't hitting the seat in front of me. My head isn't hitting the ceiling, but I still do sit at a very awkward, stiff angle, which I'm not a fan of. Let's go hop around the very back. We'll take a quick look at the trunk and cargo space, and then we'll talk about the looks. All right, so we're on the back of the Ford Tempo, and it is an American sedan from the 80s, and so it has a great big trunk. It's something that's missing from modern cars, is that they don't really have good sized trunks anymore, which is a shame. You do get this nice little logo here, which is kind of cool. Fuel pump switch off. That's really the only 80s thing you'll find back here. Nothing too crazy, but definitely nice to see. Now we gotta talk about the looks, and there is something kind of comforting about the look of the Tempo. I really like it. And this was the start of Ford's aerodynamic era. In the early 80s, they were very boxy and chunky, but Ford introduced this new design language halfway through the 80s with the Taurus, the Thunderbird, and the Tempo, the sort of more curved edges, which I really like, and overall it's very iconic mid-80s, and I love that. But now let's get on to my final thoughts. What do I think finally driving a Ford Tempo from the 1980s? Well, I think that first of all, this car is really cool to be driving. It's a really cool slice of life when it comes to Detroit in the 80s, which I always love. The Tempo is very interesting to me because it only lasted about 10 years. And although they sold in record numbers, hundreds of thousands a year, in the early 80s, they sold more than the Camry in the United States, which is wild. But Ford never really made money on them. They were selling these at almost a loss. This with the Mercury Topaz as well. People didn't really look at the Tempo favorably. I think it's hard to look at it now because there's so much nostalgia with them that it's hard to hate a Ford Tempo. But at the time, people weren't really big fans. And so in the 90s, Ford decided to replace it with the European-built Ford Contour. And I guess the rest is history. But this is just sort of a blip in Ford's history, a rather short-lived economy sedan that was meant to fight the K-Car and the J-Body. This was the hometown hero for a lot of people growing up in the 1980s and 90s. One of you has to have owned one or had a parent own one when you were a kid. I mean, come on. And so it's cool to be driving something like that, something that was used by a family and promptly thrown away. A lot of hand-me-down cars were probably Ford Tempos. And so that's also what I love, because the 80s is so stylized. The 1980s was a decade of technology and music and just good times, or at least what we commonly think of it now. The Nissan 300ZXs and Mazda RX-7s and all the other cool 80s cars, that's what we remember the 80s to be. But this is what the 80s actually was. This is the no-filter look at American automobiles over 30 years ago. And that to me is cool. This is a non-biased history book, and I'm so thankful I was able to drive it. Huge thank you to Kevin for letting me take out his Ford Tempo today. You'll also see his K-Car on the channel somewhat soon. He's been absolutely awesome to work with, really knowledgeable about these vehicles. And this car was actually owned by my other good friend Spencer, who I reviewed a bunch of his cars as well. So shout out to you, Spencer. This thing is quite the little treat, and I'm so excited I was able to drive it. But I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Don't forget to rate the video, comment on the video, and subscribe if you really liked it. Take care, guys.